I am going to blow through a presentation that I've given a few times before, but usually over the course of a half an hour. I'm going to try and do that in 15 minutes. So if you'll pardon a couple of abbreviated addresses to some, what I'm sure are captivating slides as we go through, that would probably be appreciated. The objective of this presentation is to address specifically those issues that early stage companies have in planning out and addressing an exit at the tail end of their corporate life cycle. Typically, those are difficult exercises for those that have not properly planned for it in the get-go. But most early stage entrepreneurs don't have the experience, nor do they have the background to understand and appreciate what are the areas in which they should focus for the purposes of that. So I'd like to begin, if I could, with just a description of what we mean by exit. So by exit, we mean the opportunity for the investors in a company, those that own shares, to extract value from the exercise. Owning a company is not as exciting as making money from having owned a company. There are really three forms or three different buckets of exit, three different kinds that we could talk about. The first in the green box here is the initial public offering, and that tends to be, more often than not, and we'll talk a little bit about this as we go through the presentation, that tends to be, in the mindset of the early stage entrepreneur, that tends to be the flavor that is most commonly recognized as being the form. Acquisition is the others. Acquisition is where your company is purchased by another. You receive payment for the shares in your company, either in the form of shares in the new owner or in cash, but nevertheless you're acquired by another, and obviously receivership or the death of the company is the third. Some of the characteristics of each of these, the initial public offering will tend to be a much larger score. It'll tend to be a bigger exit. It tends to happen much later in the company's life, though. To be a public company requires a quarterly reporting. It requires a great deal of overhead and burden for that to make that happen. And as a result, it really only makes sense for those companies that are at a particular stage in their evolution where they can withstand that they can handle that. As a result, as I say here on the slide, it tends to be later on. It's subject to the whims of the market. You need to play into that market. The public reporting, the last bullet there I make mention of, it needs to be, as I say, you're reporting on a quarterly basis to the street, to the market, your performance, and it needs to always be good news relative to the last quarter. That's difficult to do in the earliest stages of a company. In fact, many companies, I've worked for one, Sean and I worked together at one time that was perhaps a public company way too early in its evolution, and as a result paid the penalties as time went on, and its inability to report good news on a quarterly basis. The last estimate I've seen, and Mark can comment perhaps to you privately in the hallway afterward as to whether I'm accurate or not. The last estimate I saw was that the average annual cost of being a public reporting entity is about $1 million. So if you don't have $1 million lying around inside your company on an annual basis to spend on the appropriate staff and the appropriate efforts, the appropriate distraction on the part of your executive team to be a public reporter, it's probably not the right answer. By contrast, if we take a I skipped over trading restrictions. The point that I'm making there is that upon the crossover from a private to public entity, it's important to understand that those owners and insiders, the guys that are running the company at the point where that public offering is made, they're typically restricted in their ability to sell their shares. So it's not an immediate payday. In fact, it's purposefully architected by the regulators to make sure that it's stretched out over time, so that the widows and orphans that are buying shares when the company goes out and it becomes public at the front aren't immediately left with the shell of a company, and a bunch of guys that are living in Bermuda have left and sucked all the value out of that company and the money. So you're restricted from trading. By contrast, an acquisition tends to happen early. It can happen at any time. And in fact, there's a movement underway within the venture capital community and the early stage capital community around early exits as a phenomenon, starting companies, turning them over, selling them to other companies as quickly as possible to get the most efficient and accelerative use of that capital as possible. It's a shorter process to an acquisition, whereas it might take 6 to 9 months for you to get an acquisition from the point that you decide to do it to the point that you're ending. A public offering is a 12 to 18 month cycle, especially if you're going out onto the big boards. You may find that you may or may not be liquid. The advantage of an IPO over an acquisition is that the IPO will guarantee the fact that you have a publicly traded stock the shares that you own, although you may be restricted in the early days, the shares that you own are things that you can exchange for cash at some point. That may or may not be the case in the course of an acquisition. You may be trading paper, as they say. You may be getting shares of the new company in exchange for shares of your company, and then have to wait for some other exit event, some liquidity event to take place that allow you to get cash for that later. And there's a workout period, the equivalent of the trading restriction in the green box. In the red box, we have a workout period. So once you're acquired, you're typically, again, for the same motivations, the same reason, you're asked typically as the entrepreneur of the acquired company to stay on board with the acquiring company and to allow for an orderly transition of the knowledge from the old entity to the new. And perhaps most importantly to the early stage entrepreneurs used to running the show, you tend to lose control. It's not your show anymore, right? You now have a different set of masters, and they get to decide what happens with your company. On the receivership side, that's perhaps the most relaxing of the three options. So we talk a lot about IPOs, and as I said, the mindset of the early stage entrepreneurs, particularly in technology ventures, is the IPO is the preferred or the more common exit. And in fact, during the bubble period, that was the case. 55% during that period of the technology, the internet bubble, 55% of the exits that took place during that period of time were in fact IPOs. It was very common. The Netscape IPO was a landmark one in terms of setting that mindset as the gigantic gold rush type score that's available to the early stage tech entrepreneur if they can get it to that point. The reality is actually, though, that if you take a more broad view, if you take a look at the last 30 years, 90% of the exits that have taken place, excusing for a moment those companies that have just plain gone out of business. But if you focus on those that have managed to make their way to an exit event, 90% of them have happened in the form of an M&A. So M&A, for those that are, I found that I need to explain these acronyms at some point. So merger and acquisition. So an exit by acquisition by another company, 90% of the cases have actually been over the 30 years. And that actually bears out if we take a look at the next graph. He said, waving his hand at the screen. On this slide here, we have blue representing acquisitions, red representing IPOs, green representing a secondary transaction, which for the sake of this discussion, we don't have to get sophisticated enough to look at that, but we could either choose to ignore that for this case, or lump it in as another form of acquisition. But nevertheless, you can see that by far the minority of cases here are the red bars in the graph, and we have mostly blue across the board. So it bears out again, even in the last 5 years, 4 to 5 years, what that trend is still the case. We have blips, as you can see, fourth quarter of 2009 was reported to be the resurgence of the IPO as the exit vehicle, but you can see that trend was short-lived. It was a bit of a blip. So having said that, then I guess we arrive at the conclusion, or the point that I'm trying to make is that when thinking of the exit, one is most likely thinking about an acquisition. You're most likely talking about the end point in your corporate evolution being the point where another company has acquired you. If that's the case, then it's important to, there we go. It's important, no, I've gone too far. There we go. It's important to maybe look at a couple of case studies. I won't go into the excruciating detail that I might typically with longer time about this, but the point of the story is that this is a very high profile, well-known case of an acquisition, that of YouTube by Google. The story for that began many years earlier, though, and it's instructive to take a look at how that evolved. A venture capital firm named Sequoia Capital made an investment in Google early on and placed somebody on their board, Mike Moritz, on their board at the time. Also, Sequoia made an investment in a company called PayPal, which when acquired by eBay, the CFO for PayPal left eBay and joined Sequoia Capital.